trying something a little bit new out today. Um, Something I haven't done before. I have a blog, Philosophy Sucks, and I post there occasionally, trying to get back into posting a little bit more frequently. And I thought that maybe it'd be nice if I took the time to uh, try to, every time I post something, to do a little video, sort of talking about what the post was about. So this time I want to talk about a recent post of mine. I'm talking about Westworld, the way Westworld allows us to construct a kind of new and interesting version of a skeptical scenario. And skeptical scenarios in general are not strangers in philosophy. We've heard of them. So from Descartes' idea that the external world is not really a mind-independent world, but is rather generated from our subjective point of view, and that it represents a mind-independent world. And then the question of how can we be sure that what our experience says is out there resembles it or somehow captures accurately what's going on out there. So that's one version of traditional skepticism. How do we know that we aren't in some skeptical scenario like that? Then we go all the way to things like the Matrix, where you get the idea that, well, we could be in some Matrix-like scenario where there's a brain in the vat in the philosophical literature that is called organic brain in a virtual environment, stimulated in just the right way, etc. More recently, though, there's been an argument advanced by Nick Bostrom, which has come to be known as the simulation argument or the simulation hypothesis. And so here, roughly, the idea is that one of three things have to be true. So, but in order to get the whole thing started, you have to buy an assumption. So the assumption at the beginning is that you can have consciousness in a appropriately constructed computer environment. So you could take that either as the claim that modeling the brain in the right way produces a conscious agent in the computer simulated environment, or that you can build sort of in a non-brain way, but still in a kind of functional way, something that has experiences like ours from computer processing, information processing systems. So that's an assumption that the argument makes, and so we can come back to that, but that's the beginning of the argument. And so if you take that assumption on board, then Bostrom argues there's got to be one of three things that are possible, that are actual right now, excuse me. So the first is that we go extinct as a species relatively soon. The second is that we lose interest for whatever reason in generating ancestor simulations, where an ancestor simulation is something like a very advanced simulated world where there are conscious agents in that simulated world, something like The Sims, but with conscious agents. Remember, that's an assumption of the argument. And then, so the third is that we are in a simulation currently. So roughly the structure of the argument goes as follows. So let's suppose we don't kill ourselves off, and we don't lose interest in building artificial environments. So then as time goes on, there's going to be more and more artificial environments and more artificial agents in these environments. And at some point, the number of artificial environments and the agents in those environments is going to vastly outnumber the number of non-simulated environments. And so any given conscious agent at this point is more likely or not going to be in the larger set, the set of things in the simulated environment. So that we should believe that probably we are too, if those or one of the other two things are true. So if it's true we go extinct, clearly we're not in a simulated environment. So this may be an actual meat environment, a real non-simulated environment, and then we go extinct at some point. Or we may lose interest. We may find out this is very dangerous. People like Stephen Hawking, et cetera, have talked about it. Maybe we just decide as a culture, as a species, no more simulations. On the other hand, if we continue building more and more simulated worlds, and if you buy the idea that you could have conscious agents in those simulated worlds, then you arrive at Bostrom's conclusion. Probably we're in one of those simulated worlds right now, or it's much more likely that we're in one of those simulated worlds as opposed to a non-simulated world. Okay, so that's not exactly the way the Westworld situation works. So before I talk about it, I need to say something about the plot mechanics, and there will be a bit of a spoiler, as I've said before. So if you've at least seen the first episode. So the idea of Westworld is that there's this giant park, and inhabiting this park are artificial agents that are very advanced. We're given the idea that they are roughly like robots, but very, very advanced robots, maybe even to the point where they're composed of synthetic flesh and bone and stuff. But that inside what's going on is all computational, and you could, in effect, read out what computations are being done with the right interface. So they have these little iPad things they walk around with and use to connect to the mind of the hosts, as they're called in this world. Um, and so these artificial agents, if you, I'm not sure it's part of the show's assumptions, but we can say if you buy this argument that you could have consciousness in these kinds of simulated agents, then we could say these agents are conscious, or at least potentially conscious, and we could imagine a case where we're dealing with one that is conscious, and that doesn't mean full-fledged consciousness. These agents are scripted and they run on loops. And so you might think, well, yeah, you could. Does that mean they're not conscious? Well, they could still be conscious in the sense of there being something that is like, from their perspective, to have pains and to take shot of whiskey, or get shot in the belly, or to be operated upon without anesthesia, etc. So we might think that, look, they're conscious in that sense. They may not be self-conscious, and they may not lack the full-fledged ability of conscious agents, but they're conscious in some limited sense. They're just in this kind of loop. They're also intelligent to some sense because they can interact with the newcomers, as they call them, people who come to visit the park, and they engage in various activities, going on quests, having sex, etc., all that kind of stuff. So that's interesting. So they're intelligent enough in that sense. So the skeptical scenario then is that we may be such agents. The idea is not that we are the newcomers, the people who visit the park to use it, but that we are actually the automatons in the park, that we are not uh, as we think that we are. And so, first of all, you may say, well, look, we're biological and not robotic. And there, I think a very interesting thought is that the argument from design, which many people find intuitively appealing, and yes, you can debunk it in various ways, but it's got an intuitive appeal that's very strong, that there's something about the human body in particular that looks designed. And I'm not endorsing that view. I'm merely saying that this line of thought is very congenial to that. The idea that the body is a machine designed by an advanced intelligence is one that's not uncommon amongst people. Except there, they would say the advanced intelligence is God, perhaps, and here it's some kind of external agent outside of our artificially constructed park in the scenario I'm imagining. And so that's not God, obviously, but the point is that at the ground level, the belief is very similar. The belief is just that we are constructed, that in a sense, what we call intelligence and consciousness is artificial intelligence, is artificial consciousness. It's generated by this design process. And so it's artificial in that sense. It's artifice in the sense that everything created by this from the design argument would be. So, it's natural in that sense. So that's not an uncommon belief. And now you may say, well, look, I would know if I was in this park because people would come and I would hear them saying strange things. And here's really the key from the show, which I think is very interesting and adds to this interesting new twist on the skeptical scenario. So the hosts, even though we may assume they're limitedly conscious, they have rational, intelligent behaviors. Interestingly, whenever a newcomer mentions anything which would indicate that the reality of the host is limited in some sense, anything that would indicate there's an external, more encompassing reality outside of the park, anything of that nature, the hosts, because of the way they're constructed, are simply programmed to disregard it, to ignore it. So if you show them a picture of a subway, for instance, they say, it doesn't look like anything to me, and so they just gloss over it. And so you might think, well, look, I don't have any evidence that we're in such a Earth world, as I like to call it. So instead of Westworld, maybe the entire Earth is like this. We don't have any evidence for that. But of course, if it were really that kind of scenario, then we might be constructed so as not to notice any kind of evidence. There may be evidence all around us, evidence that this is an Earth world type scenario, but which we simply, because of the way we are constructed, remember in this scenario, I'm envisioning that we are automatons, conscious though, because that we have to sort of say, from my point of view, I feel conscious. So these things would have to have consciousness, and that's why I think that's a crucial component of the argument here. But if you grant that, then in the scenario we're envisioning, there would be this limited consciousness, you'd be stuck in this loop, and any kind of evidence that you may be interacting with someone from the external to the park, you would just gloss over. So you'd never notice. in your day-to-day interactions, anything that was out of the ordinary, and you just go about your day-to-day life. Now, so, in a really bizarre version of this kind of view, you might imagine that this world, the entire Earth, is simply a zoo type exhibit. Maybe an alien race keeps it around and they come and visit us. We may have interacted with several tentacled, blobulous, nebulous creatures and not even noticed it because we may be designed to simply view them as looking like us. But I think that's kind of interesting that this is a kind of twist on the Bostrom argument, because obviously Earth world, as I'm in sort of imagining it here, in either form, so whether it's a version of 2016 kept around for people from the year 5000 to sort of see what it used to be like, or whether it's aliens or whatever scenario you imagine, that this is an interesting way of getting a similar result from the Bostrom argument. So Bostrom argues that this may be a simulated reality running on a computer, and Earthworld is not that. So either way you look at it, there are actual physical objects. There are, this is actual flesh, and this is actual some kind of machine that's in my head. The only claim is that this is artificial, built by some other external agents for purposes that we don't know, and so there are physical objects here, and no one's claiming that this is on a computer. But if this is a park designed by external agents for the amusement of themselves, then in a sense this is an artificial environment, and we are, in that sense, playing the roles of fictional elements. Maybe this is like a live action role play scenario, or you can think of all kinds of scenarios with the basic compatible with the basic idea. But the basic idea is that this is sort of a way of saying that, well, here's a way of interpreting the claim that we are conscious computers in a simulated environment without having virtual reality involved. And I think that that's interesting. That's a kind of a novel take on this. And then I think if you think about it, that really the same kind of reasoning that Bostrom gave for thinking that this could be a computer simulated version, those kind of reasons work pretty good also for thinking that we're in an Earth world or Westworld world. And so roughly the idea is that either we go extinct or we lose interest in building these kinds of simulated realities. Let's call them artificial realities instead of virtual environments. So to build these artificial environments. And I don't see any reason to think that we're going to lose interest in doing that. We already have versions of this kind of stuff, and I bet it would continue. And so, well, at some point then, if people keep building these, you could imagine, the moon becomes New York of the 1920s, and Mars, they have, caveman adventures and etc. You could imagine all kinds of scenarios. Well, at some point, there's going to be more of these simulated artificial environments than there are going to be non-artificial environments. And at that point, if these agents are conscious, then any given conscious agent is more likely to be in one of these artificial environments than in a natural environment. And so then Bostrom's argument is suddenly giving us some reason to believe that it's possible that we are in an Earth world type scenario.